Imagine a nation of 123 million people where two-thirds of the entire population lives on less than 10% of the land. This is not a dystopian fiction, but the reality of modern Japan. Right now, 80 million Japanese citizens are compressed into a narrow coastal corridor that stretches barely 1,200 kilometers along the Pacific coast, from Tokyo through Nagoya, Osaka, Hiroshima, and down to Fukuoka. This ultra-dense linear zone, known as the Pacific Belt or TK8 Corridor, contains the overwhelming majority of Japan's wealth, industry, and urban life. Meanwhile, the remaining 90% of the country sits sparsely populated, almost eerily quiet. The contrast is staggering. Mountains rise where cities could have been. Snow falls where factories might have thrived. The question is not why Japan is crowded, but why so much of it appears abandoned. What geographic, climatic, and historical forces conspired to concentrate an entire nation onto a single thin line? The answer lies in a perfect storm of geography that made one coast a paradise for civilization and left the other locked in isolation. Japan is not just mountainous, it is overwhelmingly mountainous, with roughly 73% of its landmass composed of steep slopes, volcanic peaks, and rugged terrain unsuitable for large-scale human settlement. This is not the gentle rolling countryside found in Europe or the American Midwest. These are jagged mountains that shoot up abruptly, leaving only slivers of usable flatland scattered along the coasts. Only about 27% of Japan's territory can reasonably support cities, agriculture, or infrastructure, and most of that precious flatland is concentrated in a narrow strip facing the Pacific Ocean. The Japanese did not choose to live along this coastal corridor. They were forced into it by the sheer physical impossibility of building anywhere else. Mountains do not merely discourage urban development, they strangle it. Roads become expensive, agriculture becomes inefficient, and connectivity becomes a nightmare. As a result, populations naturally gravitated toward the few locations where flat land existed in abundance, where rivers could be harnessed, and where cities could expand without fighting vertical cliffs at every turn. This geographic bottleneck became the spine of Japanese civilization, and everything that followed was built along this single axis. Within this narrow Pacific corridor lie Japan's three largest contiguous plains, and these three regions alone contain over half of the nation's population. The Kanto Plain, anchored by Tokyo, is the largest and most dominant, home to a staggering 41 million people in the greater Tokyo area, making it the most populous metropolitan region on Earth. To the west lies the Nobi Plain, centered on Nagoya, with a population of approximately 9.3 million. Further west still is the Kansai or Keihanshin Plain, encompassing Osaka, Kyoto, and Kobe, housing another 19.3 million people. These three plains alone account for roughly 70 million people, more than half of Japan's total population, all squeezed into a fraction of the country's landmass. The concentration is not accidental. These plains offered everything early Japanese cities needed. As populations grew, so did the roads, railways, ports, and industries that connected them. Today, the Tokyo-Nagoya-Osaka corridor functions almost as a single megacity, a continuous urban sprawl where one metropolitan area bleeds into the next, connected by the world's most advanced high-speed rail network. Meanwhile, the rest of Japan, with its mountains and remote valleys, remains comparatively empty, bypassed by the economic forces that built modern Japan. Geography did not only bless the Pacific coast with flat land, it also gifted it with some of the finest natural harbors in the world. Tokyo Bay, Osaka Bay, and Ise Bay are deep, sheltered, and enormous, capable of accommodating massive volumes of shipping traffic while remaining protected from the open ocean's storms and swells. These bays are geological masterpieces, and crucially, they sit adjacent to the very plains that could support large urban populations. A great harbor means nothing if there is no city behind it to generate trade, but when a world-class port sits directly beside a massive plain, the combination becomes explosive. This is precisely what happened along Japan's Pacific coast. Tokyo Bay became the gateway for the capital. Osaka Bay anchored the Kansai region's merchant culture, and Aizu Bay fueled Nagoya's rise as an industrial powerhouse. In contrast, the Japan seacoast suffers from shallow, smaller harbors with limited hinterlands. The plains behind these ports are narrow, the mountains close in quickly, and the infrastructure costs to connect them to the interior are prohibitively high. The port determines the city, and the city determines the nation's wealth. Japan's Pacific harbors were world-class, and that advantage compounded over centuries into an unbridgeable gap. If the plains provided the land and the harbors provided the access, then the Seto Inland Sea provided the connectivity that tied it all together. Nestled between the main islands of Honshu, Shikoku, and Kyushu, this vast internal sea is one of Japan's greatest geographic treasures. Unlike the open Pacific, the Seto Inland Sea is calm, protected from typhoons and rough waves by the surrounding landmasses, and dotted with hundreds of small islands. In an era before paved roads and railways, when overland travel through Japan's mountains was slow and dangerous, the Seto Inland Sea functioned as a natural highway. Cities and ports along its shores, Osaka, Kobe, Hiroshima, and Fukuoka, thrived as hubs of trade, shipbuilding, and commerce. Goods, people, and ideas flowed effortlessly across this protected waterway, knitting together the western half of the Pacific belt into a cohesive economic zone. The sea was not just a geographic feature, it was an accelerant, a force multiplier that allowed cities separated by hundreds of kilometers to function as partners rather than rivals. Even today, the Seto Inland Sea remains a critical artery for Japanese shipping, with massive container vessels, oil tankers, and ferries crisscrossing its waters daily. The eastern coast had Tokyo's power, but the western coast had the Seto Inland Sea. While geography laid the foundation, it was human policy during the Edo period that locked the Pacific belt into place as Japan's undisputed center. When the Tokugawa shogunate moved the capital from Kyoto to Edo in 1603, they shifted the nation's political gravity eastward, transforming what had been a relatively minor fishing town into the seat of absolute power. But the shogunate did not stop there. They implemented the Sankin-kai system, a policy requiring regional lords to spend alternating years in Edo and their home provinces, effectively forcing them to travel back and forth along the Tokaido Road. This policy had profound consequences. The constant movement of thousands of samurai, servants, and merchants created a demand for infrastructure. Inns, markets, supply depots, and relay stations sprang up along the route. Villages grew into towns, towns grew into cities, and the entire region became wealthier and more interconnected with each passing decade. The Tokaido Road was not just a highway, it was the backbone of Edo-period Japan. When Japan industrialized in the late 19th century, the railways followed the same path, and when the Shinkansen was built, it too traced this ancient corridor. History, once set in motion, is difficult to reverse. Geography alone does not explain why the Japan seacoast remained underdeveloped. Climate delivered the final blow. While the Pacific coast enjoys mild winters thanks to the warm Kuroshio current, the Japan seacoast faces one of the harshest winter climates of any populated region on Earth. Cold Siberian air masses sweep across the Sea of Japan, picking up moisture and dumping it as snow, often in staggering quantities. Cities like Emori and Yonezawa routinely receive 8 meters or more of snowfall each winter, burying streets, homes, and infrastructure under blankets of white that last for months. This is not picturesque snow, it is economically crippling. Maintaining roads, clearing railways, heating buildings, and simply moving goods and people through a region that spends half the year under siege is extraordinarily expensive. These costs compound over time, making it far more expensive to build and sustain large cities on the Japan seacoast than on the Pacific side. Businesses, seeking efficiency, gravitate toward the milder climate. People follow the businesses. The result is a self-reinforcing cycle of depopulation and economic stagnation. Winter is not just a season in snow country, it is an economic burden that shapes every decision. The Pacific coast's advantages were not limited to land. The waters off Tokyo, Nagoya, and northern Honshu are home to one of the richest fishing grounds on the planet. This marine paradise was created by the collision of two massive ocean currents. The Kuroshio, a warm current flowing north, meets the Oyashio, a cold, nutrient-rich current flowing south, creating an upwelling effect that brings deep ocean nutrients to the surface. The result is a fishery so productive that it has sustained Japanese civilization for millennia. Fish was not just food, it was wealth, protein, trade, and economic security. Early Japanese coastal cities thrived not only on agriculture and trade, but also on their access to this aquatic bounty. The abundance of fish allowed populations to grow larger and economies to diversify more completely than would have been possible inland. In contrast, the Japan Sea, while not barren, lacks the same level of biological productivity. Its fisheries are smaller, less diverse, and less reliable. Over centuries, this disparity added yet another layer of advantage to the Pacific coast. It was not just easier to build cities there, it was easier to feed them. The Pacific Belt's dominance was never about one single factor. It was the compounding effect of dozens of advantages stacking on top of one another. Today, the Pacific Belt generates approximately 70% of Japan's entire GDP, a concentration of economic power that is almost without parallel in the developed world. This narrow corridor contains not only 80 million people, but also the vast majority of Japan's corporate headquarters, financial institutions, manufacturing hubs, research centers, and transportation infrastructure. The Shinkansen bullet train system was designed specifically to connect these cities, reinforcing their integration into a single economic organism. Companies cluster here because their suppliers, customers, and workers are here. Workers move here because the jobs, universities, and opportunities are here. The feedback loop is self-perpetuating. Infrastructure attracts population. Population justifies more infrastructure, and the cycle accelerates. Meanwhile, the remaining 90% of Japan's landmass struggles with depopulation, aging demographics, and economic stagnation. The Japanese government has tried to reverse this trend with subsidies, tax incentives, and regional development programs. But geography is a stubborn opponent. You cannot legislate away mountains, you cannot subsidize away snowfall, and you cannot decree a harbor into existence. The Pacific Belt's dominance is not a policy failure, it is a geographic inevitability, and this concentration will only deepen in the decades to come. Japan is not empty because the Japanese abandoned it. It is empty because it was never truly habitable at scale in the first place. The 90% of Japan that appears vacant is not a failure of planning or ambition. It is a reflection of the land's brutal realities. Mountains that cannot be farmed, winters that cannot be easily endured, harbors that cannot support trade, and plains that do not exist. The Pacific Belt, by contrast, was a geographic lottery win, a rare alignment of favorable conditions that occurred nowhere else in the archipelago. It had the plains, the harbors, the calm seas, the mild climate, the fisheries, and the historical momentum, everything necessary to build a modern economy. The concentration of Japan's population along this single axis is the result of centuries of rational decisions based on the landscapes people inhabited. And so today, millions live along a thin coastal line while vast stretches of the interior remain silent, beautiful, and almost untouched. This is not the story of Japan's emptiness, it is the story of geography's power to shape civilizations, a power so profound that it can compress an entire nation onto a single line and leave the rest to the mountains and the snow. If this story of geographic destiny fascinated you, there's much more to explore. Next week, we'll examine another nation shaped by forces beyond its control, where geography became both a blessing and a curse. Hit subscribe so you don't miss it, and if this video gave you a new perspective on how landscapes shape civilizations, leave a like to help others discover these stories. The world's economic map is written in mountains, rivers, and coastlines, and we're just getting started.